When adventuring outdoors, a tent is your number one form of protection and shelter. So the question is, which tent can survive extreme winds and which tent can potentially fail, leaving you unsheltered and exposed? Is this ultralight tent that weighs less than a pound as good in the wind as this 3.5 pound tent? Let's find out. The test will involve me setting up these tents in extreme wind and then seeing if they're able to survive gusts forecasted to get up to 70 to 80 kilometers an hour. The tents will be set up on good compact soil using high holding power tent stakes. For each tent, I'll use all of the attached guy out points and then as many optional guy out points as needed. And I will set the tents up in an orientation that I think will do best in the wind. We'll see which tents are easy to pitch in extreme winds, which tents can survive big gusts, and what features lead to a tent being able to perform well in strong winds. First, the heaviest and most promising tent we'll be testing is the Tarp Tent Arc Dome. It costs $570 and was the heaviest tent, weighing 1,702 grams. It has 8 attached and 12 optional guy out points. It's made with Ultra TNT fabric and uses 2 9.3mm Easton Cyclone aluminum poles in a cross dome pattern to provide structure and support to the tent. It is a 2-person freestanding tent with a footprint of 1.9 meters by 2.57 meters, which is the largest footprint of any of the tents tested. The Arc Dome was easy to set up in wind gusts up to 60 kilometers an hour by pre-attaching guy lines to the upwind corners and tightening them as I raised the tent by inserting the poles. Once I had each tent set up, I left it standing to see how it would do in the wind, with gusts that peaked at 73 kilometers per hour and ended up leading to some tents failing. The Arc Dome was one of 2 tents that stayed standing for the duration of the testing with no issues. I was surprised at how stable the Arc Dome was considering the large surface area of the walls, but the strong Ultra TNT material and the thick aluminum poles were up to the job. The pole sleeves that the Arc Dome uses, while a lot more annoying to use while setting up a tent than clips, seem to provide good support for the tent poles as well. I've used the Arc Dome on a trip where I estimate that the winds got up to 100 kilometers an hour and the tent was holding fine in those conditions. Overall, the Arc Dome is a tent that seems like it can handle extreme winds with no problem. The second tent that I set up was the Samaya 2.0. It was one of the most expensive tests tented, costing $1,100 and weighing 1,340 grams. It has 5 attached guy out points and then 8 optional points that come pre-attached with nifty cordage systems that merge to a ring before extending from the tent. The Samaya is made with a 3-layer nylon fabric and DCF, along with 8.7mm DAC aluminum poles in a cross dome style similar to the Arc Dome. It is a 2-person freestanding tent with a footprint of 2.2 meters by 1.1 meters, which is a little cramped for 2 people and the smallest footprint of any of the tents tested. Even though the Samaya and the Arc Dome use a similar structure, because of the smaller size, the Samaya was easier to set up in wind. The Samaya survived the entire test, including the 73 kilometer gusts, but upon taking the tent down, I noticed one of the upwind poles had a slight bend. It likely bent during the big gust, but did not deform the tent or compromise its performance. It's a very minor bend that I can fix easily by bending the pole back, one of the benefits of aluminum poles, but I wanted to mention it. I think the Samaya could use a few more guy out points along the base of the tent as well as off of the peaks, but overall, I think it's a very capable tent in the wind. The third tent tested was the Nemo Dragonfly Osmo 2P. It costs $500 and weighs 1,200 grams. It has 8 attached guy out points and 6 optional ones, and is made with a polyester nylon hybrid fabric called Osmo. It uses 8.7mm DAC aluminum poles. The Dragonfly is a 2-person freestanding tent with a footprint of 2.54 by 2.8 meters. When pitching the tent, I was able to get the inner end poles set up, but when I was setting up the fly, there was too much wind pressure on the tent and one of the windward poles snapped in half before I could get the tent fully staked out. The pole breakage might have been partly due to me over tightening one of the vestibules, but it's really hard to know. It's my experience that tents that require an inner to be pitched first, followed by a fly going on top, are very difficult to pitch in the wind. Most of the guy out points are on the fly of the tent, so you can't easily pre-attach them or have them supporting the tent as you set it up. With the Dragonfly, once you get it set up with all of the guy lines, it's a very capable tent in the wind. You just need to get it set up first. I've had the Dragonfly out in some really strong winds while set up on the shore of the ocean, and it was holding up really fine in those conditions. The fourth tent was the Durston Xmid Pro 2 Plus. It costs $780 and weighs 545 grams. It has 8 attached and 6 optional guy out points, and is made with DCF fabric and is a non-freestanding tent that uses trekking poles to provide structural support. It's a 2-person tent with a footprint of 2.54 by 2.15 meters. With an all-in-one pitch and the use of trekking poles, setting up the Xmid was very quick and easy. But because of the large size of the tent, the Xmid was catching a lot of wind, and I ended up taking it down because I didn't want to break it. It is a massive tent with really big panels, and that wasn't doing it any favors. That being said, it likely would have handled the wind if I had gotten it fully staked out, and it angled the one panel guy line away from the wind instead of into the wind. That being said, I don't think the X-Dome Pro 2 Plus counts as a failure with the wind testing, but it's not going to perform as well as some of the other tents, and it's going to be quite loud and flappy in the wind due to how big it is. Based on my experience, I do know that the smaller versions of the X XMID like the 1P and the 2P do perform a little bit better in wind due to the smaller panels that catch less wind. So overall, the XMID could survive extreme winds, but is probably not my first choice. The fifth tent was the Durston X Dome 1 Plus. It was the least expensive tent tested, costing $370 and weighing 985 grams. It has 7 attached guile points and 8 optional ones. It is made with a polyester fly material and uses 3.9 and 6.3 Easton carbon fiber poles. It is a one-person freestanding tent with a footprint of 2.25 by 1.45 meters. The X-Dome is very easy to pitch with an all-in-one pitch, but instead of pole sleeves like the Arc Dome and the Samaya, the X-Dome uses clips. Pole sleeves provide a little bit more support to poles, but take a lot more finesse when you're setting up the tent than clips do. The X-Dome has an interesting feature where you can install trekking poles to add vertical support to the top of the tent and panel support for the broad sides of the tent. I ended up using this feature and pre-installing a trekking pole on the windward broad side opposite the door, and then made sure the trekking pole was locked in and providing support as I clipped in the tent. So setup of the X-Dome was easy, and it seemed to be doing very well in the wind until that 73 km/h gust hit the tent. The gust resulted in one of the poles bending and warping a lot, and that resulted in one of the pole inserts bending. But while the length of the poles are made with carbon fiber, the inserts are made with aluminum. And in this case, it was a benefit because the aluminum bent instead of the carbon fiber snapping, and I'm able to bend the insert back into position pretty easily. It is also really easy to replace an individual pole segment if you need to, but that's not going to help you if your pole breaks while out on a trip. There are 2 improvements that I think the X-Dome could make to the design in order to help it perform better in the wind, and 2 improvements to how I set it up in order to help it perform as best as it can. The 2 improvements are that I think a second guile point lower on the tent would really help, and that cordage loops should come pre-attached to the 2 end guile points. I should have added cordage to one of these endpoints and staked it out in order to provide a little bit more support for the tent. It might have prevented the pole from bending quite as much and leading to the bend of the insert. With a couple of changes to the tent and my setup, I think the X-Dome could easily handle 100 km/h winds, which is really exciting. The final tent was the Zpacks Plex Solo. It cost $600 and was the lightest tent tested, weighing 390 grams. It has 10 attached and 0 optional guile points and is made with DCF fabric, and like the XMID, is also a non-freestanding tent. It is a one-person tent with a footprint of 2.5 by 1.57 meters. Like the XMID, the Plex Solo pitches really easily, but only requires 1 trekking pole. The tent doesn't have any optional guile points and basically requires all the attached ones to be used. But with all of the guy lines and the pyramid shape of the tent, it handles wind very well. Trekking pole tents are interesting because trekking poles are a lot sturdier than almost any tent pole out there, so the weak points end up being the tent material, guile detachment points, and the stakes. That being said, what if you're setting up on poor soil or snow? We'll get into that as well as some lessons learned from the testing in a bit here.
I've been using this wind meter set up right here in order to track the average and peak wind speeds, and it peaked at 72 kilometers an hour.
If I had to rank the tents from best to worst, the Plex Solo would surprisingly come out on top, followed by the Arc Dome, then the Samaya, the X-Dome, XMID, and then finally the Dragonfly. But this is based on setting up the tents in very good soil, not on poor soil or snow. And with that, let's get into some of my thoughts and takeaways from the testing. First up, the Samaya tent would likely be the one that I would want to pick if I was on poor soil or snowy conditions where it's really tough to get a tent stake anchored into the ground. The reason for that is it's a freestanding tent, unlike the Plex Solo, and also has a really small profile. So the smaller size is going to catch less wind and then put less stress on any of the anchor points that you have out. If you're not on perfect soil, a tent stake coming loose or coming out of the ground is going to be actually a big factor in whether a tent's going to survive extreme winds. There are a lot of other factors that wind brings to the table, like whether you're going to have sand and snow blowing into the tent, the noise of the tent, but my testing focused on how easy it was to set these tents up in the wind and then how they're going to perform from a structural stability standpoint. An interesting observation from this testing is that trekking pole tents aren't necessarily as weak in the wind as people might have previously thought. Like I said, they're not going to be as good as a freestanding tent if you have poor soil conditions or you're on snow, but if you have good soil, a trekking pole tent could be one of your best options for really windy conditions. The test also showed how much a tent that pitches inner first, where you have to set up the inner with the pole structure and then put the flyover top, really doesn't do that well in the wind, partly because of how difficult it is to set it up. I've used a ton of freestanding tents and the Dragonfly is one of the best in the wind, and it performed the worst out of all the tents in this test. The testing also highlighted how important guy lines are. The more guy lines, the better, basically, if you want a tent to perform well in the wind. I think an important thing to mention is that camping in extreme winds is going to be probably a pretty terrible experience no matter what. Even if your tent is very capable, it's going to be noisy, it's going to be uncomfortable, and really you should probably just try and avoid those kind of scenarios or try and find areas where you're a little bit sheltered from the wind if you can. Based on the testing, I have 5 tips that I think are important to keep in mind if you are setting up a tent in the wind. The first one is to make sure that you're pre-attaching your guy lines and tighten them up as you set up the tent from bottom to top. Number 2 is always set up the doors on the opposite side of the wind. So on the leeward side, this makes it a lot easier to get in and out of the tent without the tent catching a bunch of wind in that door. The third tip is that snow stakes, especially really strong ones like the MSR Blizzard stakes, can do really well in poor soil and help you out a ton. As well, longer the better with stakes. If your stake is longer, it's gonna hold in that soil a little bit better. The fourth tip is wait for a lull in the wind if you can. It could be tempting as soon as you get to a campsite to start throwing your tent up, but if you have to wait 20-30 minutes for a lull, I think that's worth it in order to get the tent set up, because one of the most precarious times for a tent in the wind is while you're setting it up. I actually don't have a 5th tip. I just am really bad at counting with my notes here, but if you guys have any tips, drop them in the comments. I'll be really curious to see them. Check out this video if you want to see me take the X-Dome tent out on a winter trip. I tested a bunch of new winter gear to see what might work, what might not, and I talk about my likes and dislikes with the X-Dome tent.